This is photosynthesis part 2, the second half of this lecture. We're going to start in the middle of the PowerPoint slides at the big picture slide. The picture that you're seeing here is going to be a large chloroplast. This is going to be all of the processes of photosynthesis in this graphic. We're going to start on this side where we have sunlight coming in and striking the thylakoids. These are the disc-like pictures that I showed you in the chloroplast. This is where the light reaction is going to take place. The light reaction is going to involve the sunlight. There are two parts to photosynthesis, the light reaction and this part on the right called the Calvin cycle. We're going to start with the light reaction first. The light reaction is going to have the sunlight strike the thylakoid. It's also going to be including water. Water is going to be involved in this section. Both of these are going to go into the thylakoid, and there's some processes that are going to occur within this, which we will discuss later. But the big picture is this process is going to produce the oxygen that is going to be expelled through the process of photosynthesis. So sunlight, or the plants are going to give off oxygen in this process. In the middle part, this is where the energy transfer is going to be occurring. Through the process of the light reaction, the energy is going to be produced in the form of ATP. That's going to be this part in the middle. That's going to be really important for the Calvin cycle. Another part of the energy process is NADPH. And that's abbreviation for a large word, and it's basically carrying electrons. That will also be required in the Calvin cycle. These will be cycled. Once they are used up on the Calvin cycle, they will swing back through at the bottom. They'll go back through the thylakoids and they'll be recharged or reset so that they can be used again. So that's why it's showing a cycle. The ATP will be used in the Calvin cycle and will rotate down to be ADP plus a phosphate in the form of a P. Once it goes through the reaction again, it will become ATP, which will be energy, and it will be cycled back. So the two at the top is going to be the energy portion. The two at the bottom are going to be the things that need to be recharged, kind of like charging a battery. Let's talk about the Calvin cycle on this side. The Calvin cycle does have a lot of processes where it's going chemical conversion from one to another, and it does look like a big cycle. This is a stage that's going to need the carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide is going to be the reactants that the plants are going to take in. What's going to be produced from the Calvin cycle is going to be the carbohydrate in the form of glucose. That's going to be the food that is going to be required by the mitochondria. Here's our two stages, and here's it written out into shortened terms so that you can understand it with your notes. Basically, the light reaction is going to use sunlight and water, and it's going to make energy in the form of ATP, NADPH, and oxygen will be produced, but oxygen will be a waste product. The second stage is the Calvin cycle. The important part that you need to know is that it does not use sunlight. It does use ATP, NADPH, and CO2. And in the end, it will make the glucose, which is the food. Repeating stage 1, light reaction, uses sunlight and water to produce the energy that is needed for the next step, Calvin cycle, and energy is given off. This first stage is all about taking in the sunlight and the carbon and the water to produce the energy. This is the energy that's going to be needed by the Calvin cycle. The second stage is called the Calvin cycle. Sometimes it's referred to as the dark reaction because it does not require sunlight. If we were to zoom in on this, we would see a lot of different conversions of different molecular structures, from 5 carbons, 6 carbons, all the way around, and they just keep cycling and cycling. They are going to require a lot of energy for all of these energy conversions, all of these molecular conversions. For every single stage, it's going to need some electrons from the NADPH or from energy from the ATP. The big picture is that it's a production of glucose, and it does not use sunlight. So let's stick to the big idea. Sunlight, water, carbon dioxide are used to make glucose. Glucose will be used to make the plant structure and food for the mitochondria. So how do humans benefit? Well, the CO2 is going to be removed from the atmosphere and oxygen is made. Another thing I wanted to point out was sunlight. Our eyes see different wavelengths as colors are reflected. Plants do not absorb or use the green light. So if we're looking over here at the spectrum, we can see that there's a big array of spectrum. The plants are going to reflect the green light. So they will be absorbing all of the other ones with the chloroplasts, and that's what we saw earlier in the microscopic slides where we saw the green chloroplasts streaming. When we're looking at the wavelengths from radio waves to infrared to ultraviolet and X-rays, there's a different amount of wavelengths, and the size down here in the bottom shows you how that wavelength is. Color is a very small spectrum. Let's talk about ATP. ATP is going to be standing for adenosine triphosphate. The triphosphate is going to be represented here as 3 phosphate groups. The key ingredient is this 3rd phosphate group. We will discuss this more in this section and in the next section. It's going to be seen quite a bit throughout this whole year. ATP is a primary source of energy in all living cells. Energy is produced when ATP loses a phosphate molecule. It is reduced to adenosine diphosphate. So in this picture here, we can see that it is 3 phosphate groups. When energy is used, it will break off that 3rd phosphate group. When it loses that phosphate group, energy is released for the cell. This is where it has 2, and it needs to get the 3rd one to be charged again. So it does cycle from ATP for 3 phosphates down to ADP for 2 phosphates. Factors that affect photosynthesis is going to be the amount of sunlight, the amount of CO2, pH levels, the amount of water, and also temperature. Here's some video clips. I will be adding into this. It pretty much gives you some different types of plants and also gives you a different recap about photosynthesis.